Welcome to another broadcast from MindZeroHealthcast.com. As you well know, weekly we are bringing up the shows to educate, provoke, stimulate, to get you to think about the status quo and to see where we've gotten to and to make some determination where you would like to be, and especially in the realm of health. So consequently, I'm constantly studying and cogitating on all the information that I've turned up, and of course over the years I've done thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of information, especially since the advent of the internet. I've become pretty good at digging up information that sometimes is very difficult to find. After searching and searching for various subjects and wording and rewording how to do the search, I've been able to come up with a huge volume of information. And of course, that's only part of the issue. The second issue is how do you take all that information and assemble it together and begin to get a picture of what's been happening, what's happening now, and where it's likely to go. So, periodically when I'm perusing a lot of material and looking at old ideas that have held on and caused people to continue to behave in certain ways based on old, not necessarily because they're old, but because they were not thoroughly researched or clearly researched at the time, and in some cases there was deliberate deceit involved, and it takes a lot of weighing and wading through and comparing to come up with what is more likely the accurate story or the truth, if there be such a thing as absolute truth. It appears that so much of the time there is a lot of, what would I say, polarity of positions sometimes, and maybe most times. Both ends have a certain amount of credence, and so to take a very forceful position on one side or the other may cause you to miss the modifying issues on the other side. So it's not always that this is the absolute, invariable, unchanging, unalterable fact, but that it is in a high percentage of the cases, like 90, 95, 99% of the time, this is true, but there's those little, what do you want to say, insertions of fact that don't quite go with the general concept. And so that's not to say that the general concept is wrong. It's only to say that, like everything else, there can be some rare exception that would alter the whole thing. So at any rate, in perusing through this material that I've been working on of the last 200 years history of health and illness and medicine and methods of treating and theories, it struck me how, as you look back, you see that a certain idea catches on for whatever reason, and sometimes it's utilitarian, and sometimes it's easy to sell, and sometimes it's highly profitable to maintain even when you know better a position, which I have unfortunately met some people in the field of medicine that were primarily profit-driven, and consequently, even when they knew differently, they continued to hand out what they had chosen to make a lot of money at. And I think I've mentioned before about a doctor I studied with in Germany. He had found that no one could help his wife, including himself, had gone to Germany and been treated by a German doctor using a totally different approach, basically homeopathic natural approach. And she improved, and no one else had been able to do that. And he came back all excited. And then as he had a dose of reality, he had spent years building himself up as a certain specialist and had refined his system so it was very easy, fast, and workable and highly profitable. And so he decided, he called me one day and says, would you like to buy the stuff I got? I'm not going to be doing it because he realized that it would cost him a tremendous upheaval in changing his whole lifestyle as well as his approach. So that sometimes can be a problem, but other times it's something more than that, and that's what I've kind of chosen as a subject for the next couple of broadcasts, because I know I won't get it finished in one broadcast, because I'm going to propose something and then I'm going to give some examples of what I'm talking about. So I've decided to call this broadcast Blind Sight. He that hath eyes, let him see. And by blind sight, I mean that someone has the capability of seeing, but for some reason there was inserted a blind spot that became a mind filter. Now, we talked about mind filters before, and so what it comes down to is assumptions. You know, you start out with basic assumptions about something, and those assumptions pretty much become law to you, so you don't even question it. It's a priori. This is a known fact. Well, we don't have to prove it because everybody knows that. Reminds me of Kary Mullis, the recipient of the Nobel Prize back in 1993 for his development, his discovery and development of a system called polymerase chain reaction, where he could take a very small speck of a sample of blood, for example, and make duplicates of it over and over and over till there would be an ample amount of DNA so that you could do a lot of testing with it. And so he received the Nobel Prize for that, and he's a very sharp individual. And I even mentioned his book before, his own autobiography of a sort called Dancing Naked in the Minefield. And he had learned about this when it got into the AIDS issue, and had discovered that he was writing this paper about a test the company he was a consultant with, and they want him to write this technical paper to publish in a professional journal. And so as he started to write it, in a professional journal you have to have citations for each of the theories or hypotheses that you advance, so that it seems there's a, quote, a seemingly scientific rationale for what you're talking about. And so he was writing about HIV and AIDS, and so he started out his article by saying, inasmuch as research has shown a causal relationship between HIV and AIDS, and of course I'm sure everyone knows that AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency, which means you came into this life with an immune system, but along the way you acquired a deficiency. And that means something happened that shut it down or destroyed it. So at any rate, he didn't know a research citation for that, so he inquired of his virologist who worked at this same organization, and he said, you know, I'm writing this professional article on AIDS, and I wanted the citation of the research that showed that there was a causal relationship between HIV and AIDS. And his virologist buddy responded, well, no, I don't know, but you don't need a citation. Everyone knows it. and something clicked in his head and said, now wait a minute, this is a professional article. I need at least some citation that shows there was some research done that actually proved, or at least tended to prove, a causal relationship. So he said to his friend, well, no, I need some specific citation. So he says, well, contact the Center for Disease Control. They have all that information. And so he did. He contacted them, and they sent him out this big packet of material, and he waded through all this material, and lo and behold, there's no citation that there was ever a study done that showed a causal relationship between HIV and AIDS. And consequently, he was quite shocked. And it started him on a whole quest to determine what's really going on with AIDS, and why is there are no studies that demonstrate the connection. And I won't tell you the whole story, it's going to take too long, but other than to say, here's a case of the virologist accepted that, well, somebody evidently must have done the study, or else we wouldn't be believing that it was true. And of course, the bottom line is, and he discovered that there really was never a study done. There was nothing to show a causal relationship. It was an assumption, and once the assumption was made, everybody jumped on the bandwagon because they had wanted an answer, and consequently, he does some humorous things that he talks about in his book. So you might want to get it. It's kind of interesting, and he's kind of not your typical scientist researcher who's back in the corner of his lab over his Bunsen burner with no one around, doing all of his research and making all these lab notes. He's a bit of a colorful individual, and he was kind of a athletic type individual. And so the book Dancing Naked in the Minefield, you find it actually in my book list. And his name is Kary, K-A-R-I, Mullis. And he has a couple of chapters that he devotes to this whole idea of AIDS and what it led him to think and do as a consequence of finding out that here we have massive research, billions of dollars every year being pumped in to deal with HIV as a cause of AIDS, and no one ever proved or even gave strong evidence that it were true. It was a big assumption, and I won't even go into the politics because there were politics involved also. And that's what he found out too. At any rate, there's a good example and a blind sight. I mean, here someone's capable of seeing, and you're certainly, if you're highly trained in the scientific field, you should be able to ascertain, or at least want to ascertain, the validity of something before you jump on the bandwagon to support it. So at any rate, the whole concept reminded me of a couple of things that I was aware of, that these are real cases, and it will help to illustrate what we're talking about. And the first is the case of a large industrial plant that had guards at the gates because they worked with a lot of small, expensive things, and they were, as happened so many times, a lot of pilferage going on by the employees of very expensive materials. And I saw the same thing happen in Ohio when I lived up near Cleveland, and there was a period of time in my early life that I worked for Ford Motor, and I realized that there were some people who worked at Ford Motor that every night when they left, they took one of the new radios that were being installed in the automobiles. Now, that means if they worked, 6 days a week, 5 days, even 5 days a week, times 50, that's 200 and almost 60 radios that they would walk out with over the year. Now, if more than one person did that, just imagine what that would add to the expense of a product put out by the company, because they're not going to take a loss. And so they know they buy so many radios, and they know they use so many radios, and they know how many they have left, and therefore they know how many disappeared. And so, a lot of the companies put up guards that search people coming out. So the story I'm mentioning, that's the case. The people had to stop with the guard every night, open their lunch pail, let him check their jackets, and so forth. And if he seemed convinced that they were clean, they were allowed to pass. Well, there was this one individual that every night when he came out, he was pushing a wheelbarrow full of straw. And the guard would stop him and search everything and dig all through the straw, and there'd be nothing in the wheelbarrow but straw. So he'd say, okay, go on. And this went on for years. And finally, the gentleman who was coming out with the wheelbarrow came up for retirement. And so on his last day, he came out, and at this point, he did not have a wheelbarrow. And the guard stopped him, and he says, I know that you had to be taking something out of this plant, but I never could catch you doing it, and there's no problem now to let me know, but it sure will put my mind at ease to know what I missed that you were bringing out every night. And the guy says, I was stealing wheelbarrows. And here's the case of blindsight. Here's a guy rolling out a wheelbarrow, but because the straw was in it, there was always the assumption, well, he might be trying to hide something in the straw, so we'll look through the straw. But somehow missed the wheelbarrow. And it happens so many times that until we have fine-tuned our vision, that we miss things. And another story, which was true, I actually saw the video of it. There was a large party of people that were at some big room, like a big ballroom, and they were enjoying themselves, and there was music playing, and people were dancing. And at one point, they turned loose a very large person with a big gorilla suit on, and sent him to mingle around through the crowd and then exit out the other side after a few minutes about mingling with the crowd. Nobody screamed and nobody made any big fuss. And at the end of the party, they interviewed the people and said, while this party was going on, did you notice anything unusual? And basically, I think everyone except one person said, no, I didn't notice anything unusual. And this one person says, yeah, I kind of did notice somebody came through at one point dressed in a gorilla suit. But the rest of the people never saw the gorilla. Never even registered in their mind that there even was somebody with a gorilla suit, let alone that it could have been a real gorilla. They never noticed. And so what happens is, with ideas, theories, and so forth, we have the same type of problem that occurs. And, we can apply it to a lot of things, but there were some particular things that I learned about that, interestingly, could have changed the whole course of the way medicine went, or could have changed the whole course of our understanding of function in the body, because of an original blind spot that was established. And once that was established, then nobody seemed to see beyond that. And every generation, it was assumed that this is a fact. It just got passed on as a fact, and nobody ever bothered to question. Now, this assumption thing is especially bad in research, because when you start to research something, there's certain things that researchers don't take on just because it's not profitable to even research it. And some because they don't even see it as an issue. And so, unfortunately, whether it be medicine or otherwise, most of the research, at least in this country and probably around the world, is money-driven. So researchers are looking to make their living doing research. And so what you do is you take on projects that people have an interest in and are willing to put up the money to pay you to research that issue. And so if you want to be a professional researcher, then obviously you need to have money coming in to pay your way and to buy whatever equipment and supplies and hire whatever help is necessary to carry out this project. And inasmuch as most of the research money is tied to profit, then they're only going to pay for research that's likely going to produce results that they can then make a huge profit on for their investment in the research. And so that in itself is a deterrent to research things that are questionable, things that are controversial, things that even if you find the answer, number one, you could be ridiculed for going against the grain of what everyone else thinks, and so forth. So it makes a big problem. And I'm telling you all this to get you to think, just like most of the stuff I do, and to remove blinders and begin to see that everything is not the way it's been, the way that it really is, but the way that has worked out, profitably or otherwise. You know, sometimes people do research because they want fame. You know, there's always that Nobel Prize. Used to be, I remember when it was about $10,000 was the cash award. Now I think it's way up over $1 million that goes with it. But the prestige and the medal and all the things that go with it, it's the one of the ultimates of being a researcher is to uncover something that leads to your being worldwide recognized in the scientific community, receive a valuable medal and $1 million or so. So, you know, it's not bad to have on your curriculum vitae is that you have been the recipient of the Nobel Prize. Even to be nominated and not receive it is a great honor, because that puts you way up the list above most others in your field. So at any rate, the research is not to find truth, but necessarily. It should be, but it's not to find truth necessarily, but to either provide support for an idea that could be very profitable if it could be supported. And sometimes researchers are kind of influenced to maybe bend the facts slightly. And of course that's what happened to the individual who originally received the credit in this country for the HIV/AIDS issue. He had actually before that been doing research and published a paper that indicated that a particular virus was the cause of lymphomas, if I recall. And anyhow, at some point it was discovered that he had falsified his research, and he was pretty discredited. You know, so he continued to limp along in the background. It wasn't that he wasn't intelligent, and it wasn't that he probably wasn't qualified to do the research. He was hoping for the big one, you know, the Nobel Prize. And it ended up that because of political climate at the time, that it was important that somebody find the cause of AIDS and settle down a lot of demonstrations and a lot of upheaval that was going on sociologically about AIDS. And so in this case, it wasn't that he published false information. It was that someone chosen by the government at that point to get out there and find out what the cause of this AIDS is, so we can put some money into it and we can cut out all this demonstration and upheaval that's going on. So this person inquiring went to several people in the research community and said, have you come up with anything regarding the cause of AIDS? And of course they said, well, no, and we haven't been working on it. We're on these other projects. And however, we did hear that this one researcher, and this was the one who had been discredited, he has some samples that came from France from Dr. Luc Montagnier, who's a researcher at the Pasteur Institute, and so he's looking into that. You might want to talk to him. So it ended up that this person went to this doctor and said, well, I understand you're researching AIDS and that you have this sample that came from France. And he said, yes, I've been looking into it. And so the lady asked him outright, well, doctor, do you believe that this is the cause of AIDS? This stuff that was later termed HIV, that virus. And he said, yes, I do. On his assumption, she called a national press conference and announced, we have found the cause of AIDS, and therefore we're putting money into it, and we're going to research this virus and find out what we can do to stop the problem. And of course, then everybody was appeased. And he went on to become famous, get a Nobel Prize, to make a fortune in terms of developing a test to test for this virus, which no one ever bothered to prove was the cause of AIDS. So, well, it gets worse than that, but I won't even take the time to get into it, except that Luc Montagnier found out what had happened with the virus. He had sent a sample over, and here's a guy getting all this accolade and making all this money. So he comes over to the U.S. and sues this other doctor for having stolen his virus. And so it ended up going into court, and the court in this country was not about to trash their doctor, who now has all this accolade. And so they ruled that it was to be a co-factor. They both would be credited with having found, and therefore they both would share in whatever the profits were. And of course, at that point, the Nobel Prize had not been awarded for it, but later the two of them shared the Nobel Prize for the virus. I won't even go on with the rest of the story. It gets real complicated, but even Luc Montagnier later admitted that he wasn't so sure about the relationship of HIV and AIDS, or at the very least it may have only been a factor, but certainly not the whole problem. So the books, actually there was a book published about that, and interestingly, I was telling a colleague about it, and I said it's an interesting story that now he's even calling into question. And so she said, well, I want to get a copy of that. So she started looking. She couldn't find a copy. And I said, well, probably you may have to call the publisher. And so she did, and lo and behold, she called the publisher, and their comment was, that book is no longer available. We have decided to pull it from the market. Which means somebody got something pretty worthwhile, a lot more than the profit from the book, to not make it available anymore. But, you know, I've been around so long and I've seen so many things that nothing shocks me. It's just that I guess what kind of bothers me is that they continuously seem to get away with it. So, and sometimes the real person that's done the real research ends up being destroyed, basically, and sometimes even physically, meaning they die from the whole thing. And that brings up a case in point that I've studied a lot about, and I thought you might find interesting, because this is all kind of laying the groundwork for 2 or 3 other areas that we're going to talk about, that where assumption and blindness have resulted in a totally different outcome, and not to the benefit of the public, actually to the detriment of the general public, and actually has led them into a position that they put on their rose-colored glasses thinking that they know something and that something is happening, which isn't really happening. So, I'm sure way back along the way in some of my broadcasts, I mentioned a doctor by the name of Dr. Wilhelm Reich. He was trained in medicine, was an MD, and became a psychiatrist, and he was, at least worked along with at one point, and was very acquainted with Sigmund Freud. And it ended up that Wilhelm, or Dr. Reich, maybe that's easier, Dr. Reich, in his psychiatry, he wrote a lot of textbooks, and he had a view of psychiatry that varied a little from Freud, and Freud, of course, he wasn't too big on people not agreeing with him I think in the medical community. Anyhow, so Reich right off became somewhat of a renegade, and a renegade in the sense that he did a lot of homework, and once he reached a conclusion, he was not hesitant to talk about his conclusion. And so where he varied with Freud was, Freud ultimately ended up developing psychoanalysis. Not because Freud wanted to treat people, but because he wanted to understand what the drives are, or the motivations that cause us to do and think and be certain ways. And so along comes Reich, and Dr. Reich said, after lots of study and interviewing, he said, when you suppress something or you repress it, the difference is suppress is a conscious act of suppression, and repression is that your brain does it or your mind does it because you can't tolerate the stress of whatever the issue is. And so Reich says that as time goes on, we engage our body with this. In other words, what we do is we actually form bands of muscle tension around our body to help hold back the issue that's either suppressed or repressed. And so just talking, once that's become chronic, is not going to release it, and therefore you can have psychoanalysis for years and years and years, and you can gain all kind of insights, but you still have the problem. And so Reich took this different approach, and of course he was not well received with the Freudian followers, and he ended up leaving Europe, and at some point he ended up in the U.S. He wrote several books, in fact a pile of books, and I'll have some, I know some are already on my website, but I'm going to double check and see if a couple that I refer to now are there. But at any rate, Dr. Reich called these bands armoring, like we put a plate of armor around certain zones in the body based on the nature of what we're doing. For example, if you're a child and you're crying and your parents demand under threat of punishment, if you don't quit crying, you're going to be spanked or whatever. And so the way you hold it back is you control your breathing, you tighten your throat, and you kind of tighten your jaw, and that's how you can kind of keep from crying. And so over time that becomes chronic, and you really have that band of armor. Now that interferes with the free movement of energy through the body, and anybody who's looked into Oriental medicine and acupuncture and know about the meridians traveling through the body, this can become a block to the free movement of energy and ultimately lead to physical illness. And so that's what Reich eventually came up with. But as time went on, of course, they didn't like it too well. They weren't too excited about his findings. At least some of them weren't, but some of them were. So there was enough doctors who were becoming psychiatrists who wanted to understand what he was doing. So they came and studied with him here in the U.S., and what he eventually had done is he had bought property up in Maine and set up a research laboratory as well as a training program. And so a lot of doctors came because they felt that what he was talking about made sense. Now, one of the books he wrote was a textbook for years called Character Analysis that was used by the regular psychiatric community. They don't anymore, I don't think. In fact, most of them probably have never even heard of Reich anymore. But at any rate, he, in all his studies, as I say, tended to run against the grain, in the sense that he really dug deep, and when he did, many times what he found didn't go with the current trend of thinking, and so he was considered kind of a renegade. And in fact, there was a book written about his life, and it's interesting because it kind of gives you an idea of the controversy about him. The book is called Fury on Earth, and the author is Myron Sharaf. And that either is or will be in the book list, but it is available. I just checked it recently, and it's still available. In fact, Amazon has a collection, and that's the one we have on our website that we can click from our website to go to Amazon. And if you do that from our website, we get a very small percentage for the referral to Amazon. And so that helps to pay for all the research and putting up this program that I do, in as much as we don't charge otherwise. So that was a good book about his life. Now, he, at some point, began to delve deeper into energy, and because he was talking about energy restriction from the bands around the body, this armor plate, so to speak. And so he got more into body energy, and at some point he declared that he was really more of a biophysicist, which meant that he was into the control systems, the energetics of the body, and so forth. And so he started doing some studies, but throughout all this, what I'm getting to is not that just because he was a renegade, but because he began to question all of those things that he had been taught as facts along the way, especially as it related to the body and energetics. So, he one day said, when I was in biology, and of course I can relate to that because when I studied biology, that's what we did. They used to have you take a glass of water, and they would take a handful of straw, and you would put in the water, and you would let it sit for a few days. And if you put that water under the microscope before you did that, you would see it's pretty clear. But after a few days, all of a sudden, you would start to see little one-celled organisms. Like a one-celled living organism, like paramecium and vorticella, and different types of amoebas and so forth. I mean, here are living little one-celled units that expand and contract, that they move. The vorticella is like reminded me of a man-eating plant of a sort. It has a base and it has a long stem, and at the top it looks like a flower, and so it would jerk out, or it would jump out, jerk back, and grab little other things out of the water as food, and that's how it lived. And so what the explanation of that was, that there were spores either in the air or on the straw that were spores of these one-celled organisms, and so when you put the water with the straw, which provided nutrients, then they could become activated and start developing. So that was the theory. And so Reich looked at that and he said, I wonder if that's really true. And so he's thinking, where did these things come from? Was what his question was. And so the explanation was from the spores. So he said, well, I need to look further at that because I'm not so sure that I can buy that as an explanation. So he starts to think about it. So he decides to take water and straw and put it in a container that's airproof and put it in an autoclave and to sterilize it with high pressure, temperature, and steam, and then bring it out. And so without it being open to the air, he lets it sit for a few days. And, well, it didn't even take that long. He noticed after so long that with his microscope, and he actually had tuned up his microscope so he could see better than the average microscope that was out. He was very German in nature, and he was able to do some lens configurations and light configuration that he could see a better resolution at a much higher power. So he noticed that the first thing that happened, there were little blue-looking units that kind of darted around in the water. And as he continued to look at it, over time, those little blue things seemed to develop into ultimately little one-cell organisms. And he thought, wow, what is that? And so he eventually hypothesized that energy is present everywhere, creative energy. And this creative energy energizes and is in the process of continuous creation of living matter. And there's some big implications of all this, and we're not even going to get into them. I'm only saying that here's a case where a person changed the way they looked because they began to question the theory that had been passed down, that everybody taking biology, including myself, had been told this is what happens. That was the explanation, and nobody bothered to really challenge it or look into it until Reich did. And so he wrote a whole book on it called The Bion. He called these little blue units bions, or units of energy. And he said, and he wrote a book describing his whole experiment, why he questioned it and so forth. So that is still available, and you might find it intriguing to follow his thought processes and his research to come up with what he did. Now, as happens, I see our time is running out. Dr. Reich eventually got into the use of developing ways to concentrate this creative energy, this life energy that's around us. You know, and today in modern physics they talk about the zero-point energy field that surrounds everything like a sea of energy, and that it's possible to draw from that. And there are some things I could tell you that would be examples of that, but it's way beyond what we're talking about today, so we won't get into that. But at any rate, he got really big in it, and so he figured out how to build a device, and it was basically a box but with different layers of organic and non-organic material, and that it would concentrate this energy inside. And then he would have people sit in there with cancer and various illnesses to energize the body, and in so doing, the illness started to get well, and did. So the medical establishment, they were not real happy about that. And even though he was an MD and all that, nonetheless, he wasn't following the prescribed methodology: surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. And so consequently, they went to the FDA and said, get rid of this guy. He's stirring the water up, and we don't want him around. And so they got a court order, the FDA did, came out, and they wiped out actually took all of his research papers they could get a hold of and literally burned them, destroyed them. They took all of his equipment and destroyed it, and they took him to court. And so in court, he didn't endear himself to the judge. He was quite indignant. He said, you know, this is a court of law. We're talking about scientific concepts. This needs to be done in a panel of scientists, not in a court of law where people don't understand the issues. And the judge became very furious at him and said, I am finding you in contempt of court, and we're going to sentence you to either 2 or 3 years in federal prison. Hence, poor Dr. Reich was put in prison. Now, the attorneys that they had decided, along with his wife and his son and a daughter, I think 1 or 2 daughters. Anyhow, they came to visit him in prison, and they had decided to appeal the sentence and get him out of there. And when they talked to him at the prison, he said, the prison grapevine tells him that he is not going to survive his prison sentence, meaning he'll die. And so they were quite concerned, and they went back home and tried to get the attorney to accelerate or speed up this appeal process. You know, attorneys are notoriously slow. Maybe by the time the sentence was over, they finally would get a hearing and get his sentence repealed. Anyhow, as it ended up, they got a telegram while they were in the process of trying to accelerate the appeal process. They received a telegram that he had died of heart stoppage. It's not it's not good to mess with the establishment, especially when there's big dollars involved. And so he did some other things. I'll just throw this in real fast. We're running way out of time already. He developed, again, having to do with this energy, he developed a big unit with tuned pipes, hollow pipes, that connected together and would run into a stream of water. And what it would do, he called it a cloudbuster. That was the name he gave it. And these tuned pipes, if you had a storm coming in, you could aim them right at the head of the storm, and it would drain all this energy off into the water and break up the storm, like that. So that's why I called it the cloudbuster. The storm would just dissipate. So he wondered if he could do the opposite, if he could bring on rain in a place where there was drought. So he went out to Arizona and spent time in the desert and was able to demonstrate that he could draw this energy together, bring on rain, and so forth. And so he was so happy with the success of it that he had turned over, now this is before the final persecution, of course, he had turned over one of the units to the federal government for their help in controlling and regulating the weather better. Interestingly, his thanks was they destroyed him before everything was done. Now, it's hard to find information about it, but I do have a little bit of information since then. There was a book written in the last few years called Left at Eastgate, and that is in my, it will be. I'm not sure if I have it on my website yet, but I checked to see if it's available, and it is still available. And it was written by a gentleman who was in the military police and was stationed over in England, at a base, a U.S. base in England. And the book was written because there was a big UFO incident that occurred there that he was involved in. And so he wrote a book about his experience called Left at Eastgate. And the two people's name on the book, they both actually shared it, was Larry Warren and Peter Robbins. Left at Eastgate. Now, in the book, he just, in passing, makes a comment that while he was somewhere on the base, he noted that the military had one of the cloudbusters there. So the government was making use of it at that point. Now, of course, it makes me wonder if you can break up a storm front, why you would allow a major hurricane to cause a lot of devastation. Something to ponder. At any rate, they have it. He gave it to him, and no strings attached. He received nothing for it, and it is available. Now, I just want to take you one fast update on it. Come forward several more years. And one of my friends in the field that I'm in, his name was Vince DeMeo, D-E-M-E-O. And Vince, late in life, decided to retire, which he was pretty wealthy. Had been a real estate broker for years and had done well. And so then he wanted to do something he wanted to do, so he got into the natural health field at a late age. And we became pretty good friends, and we had lots of discussions. Well, anyhow, one of his son became an academic and a researcher, was interested in science. His daughter became an attorney. So his son James ended up getting into a PhD program at the University of Kansas, and as a part of his PhD program, he decided to write a dissertation about Wilhelm Reich and the cloudbuster. And so what he did is he built one of the cloudbusters that, like Reich had originally built, and he received approval from the PhD department to do this paper, this dissertation on this, but it was a project. And so what he was able to do was use the photos from weather satellites and be able to demonstrate from the documentation of the time from the satellite, the images, and the time that he actually was operating it, that he was in fact affecting or influencing the clouds and weather patterns. And so he did receive his PhD in science, I guess, or physics, maybe that's what it ended up. And so he moved out into the Northwest and set up a center, and he still does research in those areas and trains you. You can go there for training programs. But he's been hired to come to different parts of the world where a drought was going on and to help bring on rain by making use of this cloudbuster. So this is, one of the issues where, and the reason I brought it up was because Wilhelm Reich himself finally decided that forget what you've always been taught, but let's do it ourselves and let's really investigate it. And unfortunately, in his case, it led to him forfeiting his life. And this is an ancient history. This is something that happened in the 1940s and 50s. I think it was in the 50s he ended up dying. And of course, there's more to his story, but that at least gives you a start on it. In fact, he did also write a book on the cancer too, called The Cancer Biopathy. And those two, I think, the Bion experiments and the cancer biopsy can give you a pretty good idea of some of the things he was into. And also there's a compilation called The Selected Writings. Now, I'm sure you're wondering at this point, where'd this come from if they destroyed everything? Well, it ended up that a lot of the students of his had made notes, copious notes of all the things he said, and had been given handouts from the school and had purchased a lot of the books before all this happened. So they were able to reconstruct a museum with all of his ideas and his books and everything that's still up in Rangeley, Maine, if you should want to do an unusual excursion and go find out something about Wilhelm Reich. There's a lot more to it. I just gave you kind of the very general information, but I think you'll find it fascinating and a case of someone who was, I got eyes, I want to see, not blindsight. And so the next broadcast will be going into some other instances of where an assumption has led to a whole industry and enterprise, and in many cases caused real research to be set back for years and years because of starting from an assumption that never really was proven, but assumed to be true. So it was nice to be with you again. Now there is a big conference coming up in Arkansas, the 11th and 12th, and I'm going to be speaking there. I'm going to be there on Friday afternoon, early evening, and do a presentation. And then again on Saturday afternoon, I'll be doing another presentation. The two are kind of interconnected. And then on the evening of Saturday the 12th, I will be participating in a panel discussion, I guess answering questions and whatever else that comes up from it. So if you happen to be in the Arkansas area or might want to migrate there for the 11th and 12th, if you will email me, I'll give you the information to make contact with them. It's not very expensive, and it's going to be a good conference covering a lot of good material. I'm, of course, not the only speaker. There will be people on growing and soil and health, and I think homeopathy and herbs and a lot of different things in the natural health field. And it's an annual event. They have been doing it every year. And first time that I'm going to be there speaking. So if you wanted to see me in person or hear me in person, I will be there. And all you have to do is to go to the website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and either that or do email, which is ddmayfield@mindyourhealthcast.com for email, and I will give you the details on it. It was nice being with you again. We look forward to our next broadcast to finish this up and see if we can enlighten you a bit more.